Just for those that are joining, we're just getting started here, so you haven't missed anything yet. Okay, so we have a bit of both, which is what I was expecting, which is great. So we're getting some people use edit mode, some people use develop mode. So we're going to talk about basically these methods to improve our lighting in our images, but we'll sort of explore both. And maybe instead of exploring develop mode at the end, maybe what we do it side by side. This is actually, yeah, this is awesome feedback. Okay, so let's get started. And I guess what I'll do is I'll create an ACDSee file so we can sort of work with our image as we go through. And so I'm a graphic designer, and so I prioritize using edit mode because it has layered functionalities, which is sort of my area of expertise when it comes to photographic art. So we'll be talking about that, and then we'll switch to develop mode, which is primarily a raw editor in ACDSee. And so we'll be going back and forth between these two modes. For the uninitiated, our modes are located at the top section here. So at the top right-hand corner, we have edit mode, and at the top right-hand corner, we also have develop mode. And so these are the modes that we're going to be principally using to go over these strategies today. So one of the challenges that you might come across in your images is that they lack a focal point in addition, a focal point from a standpoint of lighting. And so one of the things that we can do with both edit mode and develop mode is essentially add a falsified a point of sun contact, sort of essentially to manipulate our image to provide more light in an area. And there's a lot of benefits to this. And I think one of the most obvious benefit is essentially taking what already exists in your image in terms of areas of a highlight and further emphasizing that. And one of the things I noticed with this image that I sort of sourced online is this image does have a focal point of light, but it's not very emphasized very much. And I think we can explore options to sort of further emphasize that and get more out of our photo, because like I said in the introduction, this photo actually has quite good composition. So how do we do that? Well, to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to navigate to our layer section here, and we're going to be interacting with adjustment layers. So adjustment layers are edit mode's version of editability and essentially non-destructive functions. So we're going to be exclusively working with these here, and these are going to give us the ability to come back to this photo after we've made changes to it and edit these in, additionally in the future. So one of the things we're going to do here is we're going to add a point of light. Well, to add light, let's add more exposure. So I'm going to click on the exposure adjustment layer. And what will pop up here is this little exposure adjustment with its corresponding tools. Now, if I edit this adjustment just as is, what's going to happen is it's going to do an overall exposure increase to our image. And this isn't ideal because our image sort of has nice lighting in some areas, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to do an emphasis on a highlight. So for right now, what we can do is we can increase the exposure, but one of the things I want to do is I actually want to use a radial gradient to sort of create an area in our image that represents the area where the sun is going to be hitting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my actual thumbnail here, which is right next to the exposure adjustment. That's this little white box. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually navigate to our gradient tool. So our gradient tool is this tool that is located up on the top toolbar here, and it is with the shape tools. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on that, and we're going to ensure that our color palette here is set to black and white. So we can just make sure that our foreground color is black and our background color is white. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a radial gradient. So there's a couple steps involved here. We're going to make sure that we have the gradient tool selected. We're going to make sure that the color is set to black, and we're going to make sure that the radial gradient function is selected, because otherwise it will be treated as a linear gradient, which still might work for depending on your composition, by the way. But we're just going to be focusing on the radial gradient here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially draw out a gradient here. Oops. And as you can see, as I click and hold, it creates this little circle here. And the circle is where I'm going to be essentially adding light to my image here within this, this mask thumbnail. So what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to create a little circle here, and I'm actually going to position it where I'm already seeing some degree of light interaction. And it doesn't matter if I set the filtering very high or very low, because these are all things that we can adjust with the actual mask's properties themselves. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially create a little half circle, or sorry, an oval here. And I'm just going to position it in an area that I want to emphasize as a focal point. And with that complete, essentially with that drawn, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the commit button, and it's going to actually take an effect here. Oops. Let's see here. Maybe I set the feathering too high. Let's try this again. Set the MAC black. There we go. That's better. So what occurred there, just so I catch everyone up to speed, is what I want to be doing is applying a black mask, and then I'm going to be applying a white foreground color, which I'll explain in a moment here. I just had it inverted. So I'm just going to set that little circle in the center here. And once again, I'm going to click commit. And what that's going to do is it's going to create this little oval shape that exists on the filter to the right-hand side here. And then we can, from there, we can replicate this. So let's just go over that again, because there was a little bit of a sort of an error in the center there. And I'm gonna display this process once again. Let's see if I can do it inversely. So when you have an exposure adjustment, the mask is going to be by default set to white. And what this white mask indicates is that the effects of this exposure are turned on for the whole image. In essence, that you're seeing this exposure adjustment applied over the entire image itself. What we want to do here is create a spot in the center where that effect is actually being applied rather than the whole image. So what we did there is, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try using the black foreground over white, and let's see if I can get this. There we go. That's the effect we're trying to get. And in this case, what it is, it's an inversion of what we were talking about earlier. So what I have here is I have a black foreground color set to a radial gradient, and we're just adding that little radial gradient to the center of our image here. Now, if you click commit, it will add it. So what happens there is it's actually the opposite effect to what we're looking for. But when you go to add an adjustment layer to your layer panel here, the mask is always set to white. So unless you know to right click on the mask and set it to black, that will be an effect that we're sort of wanting to do, is to make sure that this is the intended effect. In essence, we have a white mask here with a black radial gradient added to the center here. And then what we do is we simply click on that mask and we click on the invert button. And that inversion is the quote unquote intended effect at the very end here. The other thing we're going to do as well is we're actually going to adjust the feathering on the mask properties. So whenever you click on a mask, this set of mask properties will appear on the bottom right-hand corner here, versus when you click on the word exposure, or the little exposure icon on the left, the actual exposure adjustments will pop up. So when we click on this little mask here, what we can do is we can actually increase the feathering, and that is going to sort of put a little gradual effect on the very edge of this, which is sort of an intended function for us. We want this to be a little bit gradual than the initial effect there. So, and then we can increase the exposure or decrease the exposure no matter how much we like in regards to this image here. So let's take this same application, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this image as an ACDSee file so we can come back to it. Let's now talk about doing the exact same exposure radial gradient effect that puts a spotlight in the center of my image here in develop mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply navigate to File and Save As, and I'm going to save this just as my edited file, and save it as an ACDSee file format. So when you're in edit mode and you save your file as an ACDSee file format, it is saved as a non-destructive file, which means that you will be able to edit these adjustments in the future. So I'm going to click on save, and then let's navigate over to develop mode. and do the exact same function, which is essentially adding a point of sun, in this case, or a spotlight for emphasis. So let's go back to manage mode briefly. I'm going to just take this same image here, and we're going to open it up in develop mode and apply the same sort of effect here. So develop mode works a bit differently in that it doesn't have a layer panel. And what it does is it has a series of adjustments that exist on the left-hand side here. And so the main differences between edit mode and develop mode are that edit mode is intended to create layered compositions, so compositions that incorporate multiple images. And develop mode is a tool used for essentially non-destructive edits intended for raw images, though images like this one, which are a JPEG, or if you're using a PNG, or you're shooting your images in TIFFs, whatever file format you may have, this still provides you an avenue to do something very similar. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to the radial gradient function, which operates very similar to the way that we were working with our images in edit mode, in the sense that it gives us this ability to place this little radial gradient here. And what we're going to do is we want to make an exposure adjustment. So the intention is to do an exposure. And as you can see, in the same way that it worked in edit mode, this is actually an inversion of the effect that we're sort of intending. So what we do in develop mode to do an inversion of our radial gradient is we click on this little icon that exists right here. And what this does is this actually creates an inversion of the effect. Very similar to the way that inverting a mask works in edit mode. So here I just have an increase of my exposure, something that I'm comfortable with. I might actually increase this a little bit slightly. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just increase the feathering as well, just so it's a little bit more gradual. And then there's our intended effect. And then we can navigate to another tool, and this effect has been functionally applied. So this is how we would add a highlight, a lighting highlight to the center of our image here, with the sort of area that roughly correlates to an area that we would see in our image here. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to hop back to manage mode to talk about the next stage of these adjustments, which is the channel selection and essentially doing a lighting adjustment to specific colors. But before I do that, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions on how to add a lighting adjustment in either edit mode or develop mode. And if there's anything I can clarify before we go on to the next step and the sort of next tip within changing these landscape images. So if you do have a question, just field them in the Q&A panel, which is just the panel that you can open up at the top, or if you want, you can just fire it in chat. But so yeah, that's sort of the initial function of adding a light. And so the purpose of this is to add a focal point in our image and to already emphasize pre-existing elements. And I can showcase this once again by just clicking on my radial gradient, and I'm just going to deactivate this shortly. But you can see that in our image here, there is already a little bit of light that exists in this area, right? And this little bit of light is what we're trying to emphasize and to trying to create a sort of emphasis in that area. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to move on to the next step. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to manage mode, and I'm just going to make sure to save this image. Just as a note, we can see our developed image here. And we, whenever you save an image in develop mode, it's going to add this little developed icon here that you don't see on these other images here. And what this icon shows to us is essentially that this image has development changes made to the image. So this is a super cool function. It basically just indicates to us, even before we've interacted in develop mode, that we have made adjustments. So let's go back. Let me just move these side by side so we know what we're working with. I'm going to go back to my ACDSee file, and this is the file that contains the edit adjustments that we can bring into edit mode. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and one of the cool functions about ACDSee files is that they are non-destructive. So we can see my exposure adjustment here, and we can see that this exposure adjustment is still editable. So I can go in and I can increase or decrease the functions of this edit. whenever you leave edit mode, you lose your ability to create undo and redo adjustments. So in a way, this is a really incredible way to preserve any changes that you might want to make in your image in the future. So this is something to just keep in mind, that ACDSee files in conjunction with adjustment layers are very powerful and provide you a lot of really strong non-destructive functionalities. Okay, so let's talk about the next stage of this. And that is one of the things I'd really like to do is I would like to address the colors in my image. And there's so many ways to approach tweaking colors. And I think that one of the ways that I'd like to focus on is using a tool called channel selection. And channel selection is going to give us the ability to focus on specific elements of our image based on certain criteria, and then make a selection of those elements. So before I do that, I just want to gauge people's familiarity with channel selection. How many people have used channel selection in ACDSee in edit mode? I just want to pull this because this was something that was added in 2022 that is extremely powerful as a function. So I'm just curious how many people have used it. So Tony has not used it. This is cool. You're going to learn something new. Kirstov has not used it. Looks like I have a hand up in the in the section here. Okay, so I've not. Okay, cool. Well, Ali has not used it either, nor has Andy. So this is a great opportunity to showcase a really powerful tool. So in edit mode, we have something called channel selection. Channel selection is a part of the select menu. So if you go up to the top left-hand corner here, you'll notice the select menu. And underneath this, there is a function called channel selection. If I click on that, it brings up this little window here, and it gives me the ability to make channel selections that are predicated on a bunch of different functions. So there's a lot here. There's RGB values for one. We have CMYK values, which are another. We have a lab color, and then we have hue, saturation, and lightness. The two that I'm going to be focusing on today are saturation, and I guess in this image we have a fair amount of greens, so we might focus on using the RGB elements as well. But if we just go down to saturation, let's just kind of pull this to aside for a sec so we can see our image. If we actually look at our image, we can see areas that have pre-existing saturation. So when it comes to lighting improvements on our image, what we want to do is we actually want to emphasize what's already there, because what's already there is good. It just needs to be further brought up. And in this case, it needs to be increased or, emboldened, right? So if we click on the HSL functionality and we click on saturation, what this is going to do is it's going to provide us this little preview. And this preview indicates to us the areas of my image that are going to change. Now, the areas of my image that are going to change are, in this case, are what is selected in this preview. And that is displayed in lighter colors rather than darker colors. So the areas that are darker essentially have lower saturation than the areas that are white or whiter or lighter gray. So those whiter, lighter gray areas are going to be what is added to our selection when we go to set this as a selection. So with saturation clicked, what I want to do is draw your attention to this set as selection function. And what that's going to do is it's going to essentially close this document, and it's going to create this little overlay over my image here. Can everybody see that little orange overlay in my image? This orange overlay is something called an active selection. In ACDSee, there's essentially a default selection method. If I go once again to select and I go to overlay options, you will have one of these three options essentially chosen. By default, ACDSee uses something called marching ants, which is going to look like this. You're going to be very familiar with this function. I'm not a big fan of marching ants, and the reason why is because it doesn't particularly showcase areas of your image that it's actually selecting versus areas of your image that it isn't selecting. Marching ants is sort of like a legacy selection method that's been used in many photo editors since the dawn of time. So what I like to do is I actually like to change this overlay option when I start using ACDSee to begin with. And I change it to selection highlighted because what this does is it shows areas of my image that essentially are selected in my image by displaying them as more richly red or less red. And so this selection method still showcases to us what areas of our image are selected, but it does it in a way that I find to be a little easier to follow. So just that again, if you care, if you don't like marching ants, you can go to select and overlay options and change it in this overlay options menu. And I just like to showcase that to people because I really prefer this overlay method. Okay, so what have we done? We've gone to select, we have gone to channel selection, and we've essentially selected the saturated elements of our image. And then we've added it as a temporary selection. So this red area on our image hasn't actually changed our image at all, but rather what it's done is it's added these to a selection. And so what we need to do with this is we need to decide what to do with this selection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate over to my adjustment layers. When you have an active selection, you can essentially create a mask with that active selection by clicking on an adjustment layer. And I'll explain what that means in a moment here. But let's, what we're going to do is we're going to go to color EQ. And the reason why is because we want to increase the brightness and saturation of specific colors in our image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on color EQ. And if you look at our mask here, it's pretty hard to see because the mask is so small. But what you'll notice is that that selection that we made in channel selection is represented in this little thumbnail here. And this is a really powerful function. This is just selected the saturated parts of my image. So if we click on color EQ here, we already have this mask set, which means that the parts of our image that are going to change are already chosen. So if we go to color EQ here, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to go navigate down to the color EQ menu here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase yellows and increase greens. And we can even see a before and after right away, just to showcase how different this is. So if we go to show saved, that's the image before this adjustment, and that's the image after this adjustment. And what we can also do is we can hide both of these to see the original. So with the exposure, like the overall exposure here, and then with this color EQ adjustment. And that's super, super subtle, but this is very, very powerful because again, we just selected the parts of my image that are already saturated. So if we go back into this color EQ menu here, what I also might do is I might slightly increase the brightness, just slightly increase the brightnesses of those greens. I'll just play around with this. I just want to get it right. I might even increase the saturation of the greens all the way. Let's just have a quick look at that before and after. Can everyone see how subtle but effective those changes are? Like that's just impacting the saturation in our image. And you can already see how much it pops in comparison to before and really puts a lot of emphasis on those parts of my image. Okay, so let's make a comparison to just a general color EQ change, right? Because you're probably thinking, if you're familiar with the function of color EQ, you're thinking, hey, Adam, why did you use this channel selection rather than just increase the color EQ on its own? So let's showcase what that looks like and sort of compare and contrast the two. So without the channel selection function, okay, so let's just do this as is. Let's just simply add a color EQ. Okay, so we're going to add a color EQ adjustment, and you can see that the mask here is white, which means that this color EQ is being applied to our whole image non-discriminately, right? The difference between this color EQ is that it's targeting the saturated elements of my image. This color EQ is going to be changing the greens and the yellows all over the image. So if we do that, so we're going to increase these, and you'll already see that first and foremost, this is quite a bit stronger than the subtle changes that we made. So one of the values to changing color EQ using channel selection is because we get to focus on a specific part of our image, in this case, the saturation, or we could have targeted lightness. versus just choosing something like a general color hue change, which in this case takes all of the parts of my image, right, that are green and yellow, and increases those values in saturation. So there might be times where you'd want to increase the color hue on their own, and there might be times where you want to actually use the function of color hue on its own because you actually like some of the colors that are in your image, and you don't want to be so non-discriminate as to increase those colors overall. The other value in this is if you have a lot of elements in your image that are saturated, this will give you the ability to sort of target those elements a little bit more specifically. Tom asked, does channel selection basically replace pixel targeting? No, channel selection does not. And so I was going to actually showcase that within the develop portion of this, but I'll quickly show the difference between these two. So Tom, let's hide both of these. If I go to select, pixel targeting has been renamed, but it still exists within ACDSee. It's called luminance and color range. And the UI is slightly adjusted, but this can essentially create a very similar outcome to what we just did with this automated channel selection function. So if I want to target a specific color, which in this case is probably greens and yellows, I could do that. And you can see the overlay of my image. You can see in relation to the image, what parts of my image are being selected. And then say I wanted to target areas of like mid saturations. Well, then I could do so using this little luminance range up at the top here. This is a highly manual process, which is a bit different from that of channel selection, which is a functionally automated method. So I just want to showcase the channel selection method because it's very good, but it doesn't have the same complexity to that of the historical pixel targeting, or what we now are referring to as luminance and color range. Does that answer your question, Tom? Okay, cool. So let's do one more selection. And in this time, what I want to do is to give a comparison between non-discriminate color EQ, color EQ focusing on saturation, and then let's also do a color EQ focusing on a channel selection of green as well, just so we can get a sort of a middle ground between those two functions. All I did, once again, was navigate to channel selection, and then I am targeting green as my channel selection rather than red or blue or saturation in this case. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly pop over to color EQ. And as you can see, the thumbnail is a bit darker and some parts of it are a bit lighter. And so the difference between this and our initial color EQ is a degree of severity, okay? So if I go in and I increase these greens and yellows again, this change is going to represent a functional middle ground between our most non-discriminate color EQ change, which just applies to the whole image, and our very subtle adjustment, which applies to the saturation. So the in-between looks like this, and it, oops, I have to increase the brightness as well. And it sort of looks like this in comparison. One of the things to keep in mind when using ACDSee is all of your pixels in your image have 4 values in this case. But from an RGB perspective, they have reds, they have greens, they have blues, and then they have essentially a brightness scale, right? So when we target greens using the channel selection, this is what is being considered, okay? So it's increasing greens, basically any image in our, any color in our image that has that green value. This is the value that we're actually increasing. So when we go to increase vibrance or brightness, this is the value that you're going to see increased. So I just want to posit that what we're actually adjusting are those values. So anyway, I'm going to just remove this from my layer here, just to sort of not showcase any confusion here. And I'm just going to focus on my initial one that I did, which was this saturation adjustment. So what have we done so far? Just a quick summary. So we've added lighting, essentially similar to the way that the sun would add light. And we've done that using a mask and radial gradients. We've then showcased that same function within the develop section. So we showcased how to do that using the radial gradient and exposure adjustments in develop. We then transitioned to talking about channel selection within edit mode and increasing the vibrances of a specific color, or essentially in this case, specific saturations within our image. Now what we're going to do is we're going to translate that to develop mode, which doesn't have something called channel selection, but it does have a similar methodology to select specific pixels. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly save my ACDSee file so I can save my progress as I'm working on it. This is within our edit file. And you can see that now there's a slight difference between these thumbnails here, as you can see. In fact, actually, let's just showcase it really quickly. So this I believe is the edited image, sorry, the developed image with the highlight in the center. And this is the edited image with the highlight in the center, but also the color EQ change. Let's navigate to our first image, which is the image with the development adjustments, and then showcase a very similar method in develop mode to increase those channels. So like I said, develop mode doesn't have a saturation channel selection, but what we can do that sort of mimics it is we can open up this color wheel here, similar to what I was showcasing Tom within the pixel selection tool or luminance and color range tool. And we can navigate by wheeling this color wheel to the colors that we want to target. So as you can see here, the things that we want to target are these yellowy greens that sort of exist in between hard greens and yellows here. And one of the things that we can actually do is we can slide this color wheel so that it's targeting highly saturated elements versus unsaturated elements. Does everybody see how in the center, there's this kind of gray part of the wheel, and at the very edge of the center, there's essentially a true hue? Can everyone see that? I just want to make sure, because this is a pretty important element to understand when using the color wheel. Christoph says he can. If I can get a couple more yeses, I'll continue. Christian, awesome. Tom, awesome. Okay, so what we can do is when we've selected a specific color, okay, what we can also do is we can draw in the saturation or draw out the saturation. So I'm going to take the center of this wheel here and I'm going to pull it towards the highly saturated hues. And as I do that, you can see that essentially I lose any form of selection whatsoever, the selection being displayed as colors on my image. And what I want to do is I essentially want to choose a middle ground between selecting all of the saturation and essentially none of the saturation. Alternatively, what I can do is I can use the same function to select just the less saturated parts of my image, and I can pull that in. And so essentially what I want to do is I want to find a sort of a degree that allows me to focus a little bit on those saturated elements. So I'm going to pull this towards myself and I'm going to end up about there. And so what I do is if I wanted to increase the saturation to these elements of my image, I can just pull this saturation slider over. And I can also do something like maybe pull in a bit of brightness to that part of my image or a bit of contrast. Now, this doesn't work exactly the same as channel selection within edit mode, but it creates a somewhat similar final product. And let's just showcase what it looks like as the original and then what it looks like with those changes. And the cool part about this is when I have an active selection, like the one I do here, I can actually just keep pulling this until all of the affected areas are adjusted to my liking. So if I like my current saturation, but I just want to apply this effect to a little bit less saturated colors in my image, I can pull that and you can see that this is changing as I do that. So very little saturation here to way more saturation here. And you can see that effect in the final product. So again, let's compare those two. And as you can see, the parts of my image that exist in this sort of middling degree of saturation are now AKA more increased in saturation and have slightly increased contrast and brightness. So that is how you would mimic the sort of channel selection function within develop mode. If I navigate back to manage mode, you can see, let's compare these two. Just make sure I saved that. Okay, that active, nice, okay. Just double checking to make sure I have all those actives. So I can actually look at these using the compare and contrast, and you can see that I really hope you can see this. There is a difference between the develop mode version and the edit mode version. And it's so subtle, but when we're going to compare these to the original image, you'll see exactly what they look like at the very end. It's going to be pretty fun. So, okay, so those are the two images. And those are the adjustments that we've made to the channels. So, okay, so just a quick summary, and then we'll talk about the third sort of funky tool that we can use to adjust these images. But we've added the spotlighting to both our developed image and our edited image. And then we've also adjusted channel selection, focusing on saturated elements in our image in both edit mode and develop mode. Now let's talk about quote unquote dodging for emphasis. So, you know, the old dodge tools are not as present in ACDSee these days, but there's a very similar function to that, which is essentially adjusting exposure and then using a mask to paint it on. And I'll explain what that means. So here's our image. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add pop to this image. And the way that we do that is by adding another exposure adjustment. So you can see my initial exposure adjustment with the centered lighting portion here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this again, and it's going to add an exposure adjustment. What we don't want to do is just increase our exposure blatantly here, okay? That's not what we want to do, because we want to paint on little elements of exposure in our image. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on our mask, and we're going to set this mask as black. And what this is going to do is, even if we have this exposure increased, what you can see is no change has been made to this image. Does anyone know why, when I have a black mask and an exposure adjustment increased, does anyone know why there is no effect that applies? And if you don't know the answer to this, you can say you don't know. I just want to get a clarification to people that maybe understand how masking works. Nice. Ali got it right away. Okay, sweet. You guys all have it. So when we have a mask that is black, black turns the effects that we're seeing, in this case, in this increased exposure, off. It turns them off. And so when we compare this to our exposure lighting adjustment that we made earlier, the difference is that this exposure adjustment is black, but there's this big white blob in the center of it. And that big white blob is ACDSee telling, essentially saying to this image, increase this exposure in the area of this mask that is displayed in white. So we're going to take this exact same methodology and we're going to apply it to this new exposure adjustment thumbnail mask. So once again, we right click on our mask. Masks by default are white, which means they're turned on. What we're going to do is we're going to set this mask to black. What you can also do is you can invert your mask, and that will essentially turn it to either black or white. Another thing you can do is you can click on the actual mask thumbnail itself and you can invert it right from there. You don't need to right click on your image. Keep in mind that inversions will also incorporate any sort of adjustments to the masks, and they will also be subsequently inverted. So if you want to start from scratch, you have to go back and set your mask as either black, as white, or as white. So mask thumbnail selected. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my brush tool. My brush tool is up in the selection set here, or no, sorry, not in the selection, the shape tool up here. And this is very, very, very important. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my foreground color is the opposite to my mask color. Okay, so what this does is it suggests that I would now be turning on a part of my image when I brush onto it, okay? And we can show exactly what that looks like. So as I brush onto this little fern here, you can see my mask now represents this little white portion here, but then we can also see that exposure adjustment come through, okay? So this is totally non-destructive because look at what I can do. I can go in, I can actually reduce the degree of exposure on that part of my image. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that my feathering is set pretty high. And so feathering increases the severity from the point, your nib point, essentially your marker point, to a external point. So it creates this sort of gradient between where you click and the very final edge of that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through, and much like how I would dodge and burn historically, I'm just going to go through and I'm going to just lightly sort of click on parts of my image. And the areas that I'm clicking on are parts of my image that actually contain some degree of already pre-existing light. So again, what I'm doing is I'm just adding a degree of exposure to areas that already have some degree of exposure present. And so what this does is this really creates a sort of emphasis on my image that wasn't there previously. And so it really presents to us like a pretty staggering degree of contrast without actually adjusting the contrast meter itself, without actually plunging our shadows into blacks, without plunging our highlights into whites. We can create that similar effect. So I'm just going to paint on a little bit. I'm pretty happy with that. I don't want to go into too much depth on it. And then what I can do is I can either adjust my exposure here or to an area that I find suitable. I can even add a little bit of contrast to that exposure. And what I can also do is if I sort of find a nice middle ground between there, but I want to slightly reduce the opacity of this layer, I can essentially turn a layer off by lowering the opacity or have the full effect by increasing it to 100. So that was a little quick exposure lighting adjustment within this editing tool. What I'm going to do within edit mode, sorry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to file. I'm once again going to save this file. And then let's look at how we can do the exact same function within develop mode as well. So now when we look at the two, so one will be developed on the left, and then the other will be highlighted using a degree of exposure on the right. And again, we can really see a difference between those two images. So let's go to our development image. Let's go click on develop mode to bring it in. And we're going to do the exact same thing. This time what we do is we click on the brush tool within develop mode. And I'm just going to hide the color wheel for now. And with a brand new brush, so the brush is indicated by this icon down at the bottom. So this shows to me that my brush is both turned on and visible. What I can do is I can literally go in and, let's turn that off. I can go in and I can actually create that same adjustment. And I can even reduce the feathering, increase the feathering, there we go. I can sort of reduce the exposure amount as I'm editing. And I can just go through and add little touch points where I would where I would have essentially dodged this part of my image. So I'll essentially dodge the same leaves here, go through, and just really add a little bit of light to this image that gives it a real sense of pop. Is there anything that might be a bit high. Maybe I'll turn it down a little bit. That's probably more and I don't know if I like it that much right there. That looks a bit better. Yeah, I like that. It's actually looking great. So we'll navigate back to manage mode, and we can see again the sort of similarities and differences between these two methods. So we have the highlights displayed in develop mode on the left, and then finally we have the highlights in addition to these other adjustments displayed on the right here in edit mode. And you can really see a pretty dramatic difference between these two in terms of their executions. And so what this should showcase to you is that, I think importantly, is that the tools that are indicated in develop mode are actually really different from the ones that are in edit mode. And I think like one of the common questions that comes up about ACDSee, which is, hey, what's the differences between edit mode and develop mode? It seems like you can do the same things. And the answer to that is, yeah, you can within reason, but these tools do really have like incredible strengths in different areas, and you can get similar results, but maybe not the exact same results. I am actually personally partial to the edited version over the developed version because I think its subtleness is slightly greater, and that comes down to that channel selection that we were able to create. I think with enough playing, you can really get a similar result in develop mode. But I just want to say, just for myself, I'm really appreciating how this image looks, and I think it actually really does honor the original image in a way. Okay, so I guess the other thing that we should really talk about too is essentially seasonally changing our image. So if I bring my edited file into edit mode, we can create a pretty sweeping seasonal change to our image that looks very similar. So what I can do is if I wanted, how do we want to go about this? I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a general color EQ change to this. You could also get similar results using vibrance, but I'm going to take my color EQ layer here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to the hue panel within color EQ. And so what the hue panel is going to do is it's allowing us to essentially shift the hues that we see in our image. So it enables us to take this image and we could make it autumn, or we can make it even further into, say, more of like a spring or even like an end of winter kind of appearance to it. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So we'll take our color EQ layer, and actually if we click on that and click on hue, we can change these greens. And as you can see, as I pull that up, it makes them more red. And if I pull it down, it makes them more lush and more green. And so if we wanted to, in essence, create a little bit of a sort of autumnal look, I could just slightly increase the yellows and greens in my image. And let's see if I can compare that to what they looked like previously. So that was the default, and that's the slight change. So you're getting a bit more gold colors and crisp sort of yellows in there. Or we could take those same tools, like I said, and actually just pull them down, especially the greens here. And what this is going to do is it's going to make them even more lush. And so there is a bit of limitations to how much yellows you can add to your image. Well, in this case, it is because of the sort of pre-existing colors and the amount of reds that are also present in our image. But if we pull those values down, you can see that we can really apply a pretty significant seasonal change from the default here to those lush full greens that you see there. And then I can once again save these edits to my ACDSee file here, along with the others, and we can have a look at doing the exact same within develop mode here. And maybe for contrast, what we can do is go into color EQ in develop mode, and let's try to get a more of a yellowy appearance here. Let's see if we can pull some of those greens and yellows into sort of a more of a autumnal look here. I don't want to have it look too yellow. I want it to be just subtle here. I think in this case, it might be a little bit better with more yellows pulled in than the actual greens. But that's a pretty compelling light, sort of almost like a orangey green there. So if we go and we save those color mode adjustments, we've done a little bit of a sort of a really substantial color variation between these two images, which give them completely different seasonal feels, right? Totally different from the original image. And I think maybe the last thing that I want to focus on is if we actually say we duplicate this original image here, we do that. I'm going to put it in the front of my list here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this duplication, and I'm going to actually set it to its original state. And what this is going to do is it's going to give me the ability to actually compare the three of those images. So here's our starting image, and then here's our two variational edits. So on the left here, you can see what we started with. And then in the center, you can see kind of making more of an autumnal change in develop mode using added lighting, essentially dodge and burn functionality, in addition to complete channel adjustments. And then the same sort of functions, adding a spot adjustments using dodge and burn, in this case exposure, and then also using a channel selection using the sort of saturation selection, in addition to a spot lighting tool. And so the difference between these three images is like powerful and substantial. And, you can get so much landscape variety with just these small tools. You can add a spotlighting that puts emphasis on one area or draws a focal point inwards. You can use those channel selections, whether it be using sort of the color wheel adjustments or using an actual channel selection that focuses on either saturation or an RGB value. And you can tweak those values using their color EQ or whatever adjustment layer you want. I could have pulled these into vibrance and got sort of different results from this. And then, really importantly, utilizing just exposure in conjunction with masks or sort of a similar masking adjustments in develop mode to get those end results. So what does everybody think? These are sort of those three here. Let me zoom in. That's kind of a cool way of looking at it. Those are sort of three totally, simple and applicable ways of getting really powerful adjustments to your image here. And these can be applied to any landscape image. It doesn't just necessarily have to be sort of darker images like this one. You can really utilize these same tools to get emphasis in cityscapes and that sort of thing. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions? That sort of covers everything I wanted to talk about within this hour-long workshop here. What do you have to say? Awesome. Sarah Gilk said, that's a very cool tutorial, Adam. I'll be using this. I'm so glad. And everything made sense, Sarah, like the differences between edit mode and develop mode, like all of that sort of technically made sense. Useful, said Ali. You're welcome. Awesome. Frondo said, I'll use channel selection from now on. Sweet. Absolutely. Super clear. Awesome, Sarah. I'm really glad. Cool. Jim said, awesome. Yeah, so like all of our workshops, what I'm going to aim to do is have this uploaded to our YouTube channel. And so this is going to be something you can watch in the future if you want to rewatch it. Or if you missed maybe the beginning portion of it and you want to sort of check that out, I will upload that to our YouTube channel. And maybe what I'll do is I'll provide a link to our YouTube channel now so everybody knows where that is. That's here. Christoph, thank you. So our YouTube channel is ACDSee, youtube.com/ACDSee Photo Studio. And my email, once again, if you have any questions, concerns, or suggestions for the software, is aprice@acdsystems.com. And yeah, please don't hesitate to email me. I love receiving it. Also very important. I've been asking people because we've been doing these workshops for a really long time. If you found this useful, and you like this, can you please email me and just provide a quick testimonial? The intention for that is we want to create a little anonymous space that showcases those testimonials and people's experience with them. So if this was a valuable experience to you, just shoot me even like a 50-second little, a 50-word email that just says, hey, this is what I found useful or whatever. And again, those will be anonymous. They won't have your name attached to them or anything like that. Not unless, of course, you want it. So yeah, but please email me at aprice@acdsystems.com. And then please just subscribe to our YouTube channel. We hope to earn your subscription. Check out the content there. And if you like it, then, subscribe and click the bell icon. And that's how you can get more of our content in the future. So this was our inaugural community workshop, and I just wanted to first and foremost thank everyone for participating. And we're really sort of working on changing the way that we interact with people in our community portal, and we're going to be doing so many more of these. So even if you weren't able to participate in the whole thing, don't worry about it. There's going to be tons more of these in the future. And I wanted to thank everyone so much for participating. I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to leave the lobby open for a little bit just so everybody can grab either my email link or go to the YouTube page. And then in about 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to close this workshop for everybody. Thank you again. Take care. I hope you have a great rest of your day.